Welcome to Relaxation Philosophy, a quiet place to unwind and settle down, where we explore the minds and teachings of history's most profound philosophers and thinkers, softened by the comfort of stillness. I'm very glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, give yourself a moment to arrive fully and to become present in the space around you. Let your shoulders sink a little. Let your jaw loosen. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to enter a state of relaxation, gently leaving the weight of the day behind. Tonight we begin a long, quiet journey through the mind of one of the most curious, melancholic, and quietly revolutionary thinkers who ever lived. A man who turned philosophy inward, away from grand systems and cold abstractions, and into the trembling, particular life of the single human being. His questions were not the questions of the lecture hall. They were the questions you whisper to yourself in the dark, when no one is listening and no one can answer. Questions about who you really are beneath all your social masks, about whether your life means anything at all in the great quiet of the universe, about what it would mean to truly believe in something when reason cannot prove it, about the strange dizziness that comes over you when you realize, perhaps for the first time, that the shape of your life is yours to choose. His name was Søren Kierkegaard. And tonight, in this first of 3 quiet evenings together, we explore the foundations of his thought, the world he lived in, the melancholy he carried with him like a small, faithful shadow, the vast, impressive philosophical systems he rebelled against, and the strange, intimate philosophy he built in their place. A philosophy not of doctrines but of becoming, not of conclusions but of inwardness, not of crowds but of single, solitary souls. There is no need, as always, to grasp every concept. No need to remember every name. Let these ideas come to you the way evening comes to a room, unhurried, gradually, until the whole space is changed without you quite noticing how. Kierkegaard himself believed that the truths that matter most cannot be grasped quickly. They have to be lived with, slept with, breathed in slowly over time. So that is exactly how we will approach him tonight. Settle in. Slow your breathing down. We are about to walk together through the cold, gray, lamplit streets of 19th-century Copenhagen. Chapter 1. The Streets of Copenhagen. To meet Søren Kierkegaard, we must first walk through the city he refused to leave. Copenhagen, in the middle of the 19th century, was a small kingdom's small capital. It was a place of cobbled streets and church bells, of canals reflecting tall, narrow houses, of merchants and ministers and gossiping students, all of them bound together by the strange intimacy that only a small city can produce. Everyone knew everyone. Reputations were built and shattered over coffee. Conversations in cafes were repeated at dinner tables. The whole city, Kierkegaard said, lived under the steady gaze of its neighbors, like a great public room with nowhere to hide. If you imagine yourself walking those streets in the year 1843, you would see a thin man, slightly stooped, with one shoulder higher than the other, dressed in dark clothes that had once been fashionable. His hair would be combed up into a strange, tall wave at the front of his head. His eyes would be quick, attentive, almost mischievous. He would greet acquaintances with sharp, witty remarks, smile politely, and walk on. To anyone watching, he would seem like one more idle gentleman of leisure, taking the air, gathering material for nothing in particular. You would not guess that this slight, awkward man had gone home each night, and written, in feverish secrecy, some of the most demanding and deeply personal philosophy ever produced. You would not guess that beneath his clever surface, there lived a sorrow he called, simply, the thorn in the flesh. You would not guess that he believed himself to be carrying out a single, terrible mission, given to him by God, and that the mission was to introduce Christianity into Christendom. You would not guess that this man, whose name no one outside Denmark would have recognized, was quietly inventing what we now call existential philosophy. Kierkegaard loved Copenhagen, and he hated Copenhagen, and he could not leave it. He would walk for hours each day through its streets, partly because walking calmed his nerves, partly because he believed his thoughts ripened best in motion, and partly because the city itself was his laboratory. He studied its citizens the way a naturalist might study a colony of bees. He listened to the way they spoke. He watched the way they hurried to church on Sunday, and forgot the sermon by Monday afternoon. He noticed how they used grand words like truth and eternity to mean nothing in particular. He noticed how easily they congratulated each other on being good Christians, while living lives that bore no resemblance to anything Christ had ever asked of anyone. And he was not cruel about it, exactly. He understood the temptation, because he felt it in himself. He understood how comfortable it is to belong, to nod along, to use the same words as everyone around you, and assume that the words are doing the work that life is supposed to do. He understood how easy it is, in a small city in a Christian kingdom, to believe that you are saved because everyone you know is saved, and then to think no more about it. But he could not let it rest. Something in him, a stubbornness, a melancholy, a sense of being called, would not let him simply blend into the soft, agreed-upon surface of his society. He felt that there was something terrible in the way his neighbors had domesticated the deepest questions of existence, the way they had turned the trembling intimacies of faith and meaning into well-mannered topics for after-dinner conversation. He felt that the great words had been used so often, so casually, that they had been worn smooth, like coins that have lost their faces. So he resolved, in his quiet way, to make those words strange again, to make people feel, just for a moment, what it would actually mean to stand alone before God, what it would actually mean to choose, what it would actually mean to believe. That is the project of his entire life. That is what he wakes each morning to do. That is what he carries with him, like a small private torch, through the streets of Copenhagen as the lamplighters begin their evening rounds. If you stand quietly for a moment in your imagination, at the corner of one of those narrow streets, you can almost see him pass. A thin man, slightly stooped, an umbrella under one arm, deep in some private conversation with himself, bowing politely to a passing acquaintance, and walking on into the gathering dusk. Chapter 2. The Inheritance of Melancholy. To understand Kierkegaard, we have to understand the strange, sorrowful house he was born into. He was born in 1813, in Copenhagen, the youngest of 7 children. His father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, was a successful wool merchant who had risen, against all expectation, from the bleakest poverty in the Jutland Heath to genuine wealth in the capital. By the time Søren arrived, his father was a man of means, a man of austere piety, and a man weighed down by something that the young Søren would only slowly come to understand. A sorrow, a guilt, a thorn in his own flesh, that would, by some terrible inheritance, become the thorn in his son's flesh as well. There is a story that Kierkegaard later wrote down, in the most private of his journals, which he called The Great Earthquake. He does not tell us all the details. He veils it, as he veils so much in his work. But somewhere around the age of 22, in a single conversation, his father revealed to him a secret about their family. A secret about something his father had done, or felt, in his earliest years. A secret that, in his father's mind, had brought down upon them all a quiet, generational curse. The young Kierkegaard never recovered from this conversation. It seemed to him that he understood, suddenly, why so many of his brothers and sisters had died young, why the household had always been heavy with something that was not quite spoken, why his father, even at the height of his wealth and respectability, walked through his own home like a man in mourning. Whatever the precise content of that revelation, the consequence was the same. From that moment on, Kierkegaard regarded himself as marked. He felt that joy was not, perhaps, available to him, in the simple way it seemed available to his friends. He felt that his life had a quiet, downward gravitational pull. He felt that he was carrying something, and he made what he later called the categorical decision that he would never marry, never father children, never settle into the ordinary forms of human happiness. He would offer up his life, instead, to thinking, to writing, to being, as he put it, an exception. The melancholy that resulted was not depression, exactly, in the modern sense. It was not paralysis. He was, in fact, ferociously productive, intellectually electric, witty in conversation, generous with friends, easily brought to laughter. The melancholy lived underneath all of that, like a deep underground river. It colored everything without flooding anything. It was, he sometimes said, the dowry he had been given, and his task was to use it, not to escape it. There is something tender, almost childlike, in the way he speaks of this melancholy in his journals. He describes himself as a strange, sensitive boy who had felt, even very young, that the world was charged with a meaning the adults around him did not seem to notice. He remembers walks with his father through the rooms of their Copenhagen apartment, when his father, unable to take the boy outside, would invent imaginary walks for them. The two of them would pace from one end of the room to the other, and his father, with great seriousness, would describe what they were seeing: the shop windows, the carriages, the faces of strangers passing, the wind in the chestnut trees along the canal. The boy's imagination would spin out whole worlds from his father's words. They would walk for hours together this way, in a small apartment in Copenhagen, two melancholy figures inventing a city. And it is in those imagined walks, perhaps, that we already see something essential about the man Søren would become. Reality, for him, was never simply reality. It was always reality plus what one made of it. The world arrived to him pre-mixed with imagination, with mood, with meaning. He could no more believe in a flat, neutral, objective world than he could believe in a flat, neutral, objective God. Everything had texture. Everything had weight. Everything was either heavy with possibility or hollow with avoidance, and the difference was never something the world told you. It was something you had to feel from inside. This is part of why he became, eventually, the great philosopher of inwardness. Because for him, the inside was where the world actually happened. The same street, walked by two different souls, was two different streets. The same God, prayed to by two different hearts, was two different gods. The same life, lived from two different inwardnesses, was two different lives. Chapter 3: The Battle Against the System. The philosophical air of Kierkegaard's Europe was filled almost completely by one figure: Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel had died in 1831, when Kierkegaard was a teenager. but his influence had only grown stronger. Across the German-speaking world and across into Denmark, Hegelianism had become the official intellectual language of the educated classes. In universities, in seminaries, in liberal newspapers and conservative ones, in church pulpits and student cafes, people were speaking Hegel's language whether they realized it or not. They spoke of the dialectic. They spoke of spirit unfolding in history. They spoke of the great synthesis that would reconcile all opposites and bring contradiction itself to its proper place. They spoke, above all, of the system. It is hard today to convey how serious this was. Hegel had offered something almost intoxicating, the promise that philosophy, at long last, was complete. That every previous thinker had said something partial, and that he, Hegel, had now gathered all the partial truths into a single great architecture that contained and transcended them. The world, Hegel said, was the unfolding of reason itself. History had a direction. Contradictions resolved themselves. Even religion, even art, even ethics had their proper place inside the system. There was nothing left over. Nothing escaped. Nothing was merely accidental. Even your own life, however small and confused it felt from the inside, was a moment in the great rational story of spirit coming to know itself. Kierkegaard read it all. He read Hegel, and he read Hegel's followers. He read the Danish Hegelians and the German Hegelians. He read the theologians who were now busy trying to translate Christianity into Hegelian categories, explaining that the incarnation was the sublation of the finite into the infinite, that resurrection was the dialectical movement of spirit, that faith was a slightly crude version of philosophical knowing. He read all of it carefully, deeply, with respect for the ambition of the work. And then, very quietly, he set himself against it. Not because he doubted Hegel's intelligence. He did not. He admired Hegel as a thinker, and he admired the architectural beauty of the system. He set himself against it because he felt, with a deep, almost bodily certainty, that something monstrous was happening underneath all this brilliance, that something had been forgotten, that something had been quietly stepped over. What had been forgotten was the existing individual. You. The actual person sitting somewhere right now, listening to these words, breathing slowly into the hush of evening. The person with a particular face, a particular history, a particular name, a particular fear of death, a particular ache for love, a particular mother and father and childhood, a particular body that will one day stop. That person. The person who must, in fact, live the life that the system claims to have explained. The system could explain everything, except the one who was doing the explaining. It could speak grandly about the nature of human existence in general, but it had nothing to say to the particular human being, in his particular bedroom, on his particular Tuesday night, agonizing over a particular decision. It could speak about the dialectical resolution of contradiction, but it had no comfort for the man who was actually torn in two. It could speak of the idea reconciling with itself in history, but it could not look the suffering child in the eye. And worse, Kierkegaard thought, the system produced a particular kind of person. A person who used grand words about spirit and history and totality, but who, in his own actual life, made no decisions, took no risks, entered no commitments, and quietly avoided every genuine encounter with himself. The system had become, he said, a way of escaping yourself, a way of climbing up into a tower of universal concepts, so that you would never have to come back down to the small, terrifying, ordinary work of being a particular human being who has to choose. He used to make fun of this in his books. gently and not so gently. He liked to imagine a Hegelian professor who could explain the entire structure of world history, who could lecture beautifully on freedom and necessity and the unfolding of the absolute, but who could not summon the courage to ask a woman to marry him, or to apologize to his brother, or to admit that he had been wrong about something small. He has built the universe, Kierkegaard liked to say, but he has forgotten where he himself lives in it. This is the first of Kierkegaard's great quiet rebellions against system, against totality, against the temptation to use philosophy as a hiding place. He insisted, with stubborn tenderness, that the most important question was not how the universe fits together, but how you fit into your own life. Not what the dialectic is doing in history, but what you are doing in your own evening, with your own choices, in your own one small, precious, finite passage through the world. And once you have begun to feel the difference between those two questions, you have already begun to think with him. Chapter 4. Subjectivity is Truth. Out of this rebellion, slowly, Kierkegaard developed one of his most famous and most easily misunderstood phrases. Subjectivity is truth. You can imagine, perhaps, how badly this can be heard. People sometimes hear it as if Kierkegaard were saying that there is no real truth, that everything is just personal opinion, that what is true for you is true for you, and what is true for me is true for me, and there is nothing more to be said. That is not at all what he meant. In fact, that kind of breezy relativism would have horrified him. What he meant was something much stranger and more demanding. He drew a careful distinction between two kinds of truths. There are truths whose content is independent of you, what we might call objective truths. The earth orbits the sun. 2 and 2 make 4. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. These truths do not need you in order to be true. Whether or not you exist, whether or not you believe them, whether or not you understand them, the planets keep moving, the numbers keep adding, the water keeps freezing. For these kinds of truths, your relationship to them is essentially incidental. The truth lives over there, in the world, and you simply receive it, like a fact handed across a desk. But there is another kind of truth. There are truths whose entire meaning depends on the way you stand in relation to them. Consider the difference between the sentence, "Love exists in the world," and the sentence, "I love you." The first can be examined from a distance. The second cannot. The second only becomes true to the degree that you actually mean it, that you actually live it, that you actually risk yourself in saying it. If you whisper "I love you" with no inwardness, with no depth of feeling, with no willingness to keep faith with what you are saying, the sentence is not true, even if you can pronounce all the words correctly. For Kierkegaard, the deepest questions of human existence, questions of God, freedom, meaning ethical duty, faith, belonged in the second category. They were not questions you could answer from outside yourself. They were questions whose answer was your own life. To hold them at arm's length, to discuss them as if they were chemistry, was already to have failed to understand them. Their entire weight depended on the inwardness with which you took them up. That is what he meant by subjectivity is truth. Not that truth is whatever you make it, but that for some of the most important truths, the how of your relating to them is part of the what. The man who says God exists with no inward trembling, no transformation of life, no real relationship to what he is saying, has not actually said anything true. He has merely arranged words. The man who lives, faithfully, the life of someone in relation to God, is in the truth, even if his theology is poor. There is something almost devotional in the way he describes this. He compares it, in places, to the difference between hearing a piece of music and merely reading the score. Two listeners can be looking at the same notes. One of them is moved to tears. The other is bored. The notes are the same. The truth, somehow, is not. Or he compares it to the difference between knowing how to swim and merely knowing the physics of swimming. The drowning man does not need a treatise. He needs to be the kind of being whose body has, in some way, taken in the truth of swimming, made it part of how he moves. For Kierkegaard, all the deepest truths have this quality. They are truths that must be moved into, truths that must be inhabited, truths whose meaning is your becoming. And once you have grasped this, even faintly, even drowsily, even in the slow, unfolding hush of an evening like this one, you have already left a great portion of modern philosophy behind. You have already begun, in your own quiet way, to walk with him. Chapter 5: The Single Individual and the Crowd. Now, slowly, almost gently, Kierkegaard begins to draw an even sharper line. A line between two ways of being a self, two ways of standing in the world. He calls them, in different places by different names, but the essential contrast is simple. There is the single individual, and there is the crowd. By the single individual, he does not mean the lonely person, or the antisocial person, or the person who refuses to belong. He means something more spiritual than that. He means the person who has come, somehow, to face their own existence in their own particular voice. The person who has stopped hiding behind the opinions of their neighbors, the slogans of their party, the comforts of their inherited beliefs. The person who has gathered themselves up, as it were, into a single pointed presence, and who is now answerable for their own life, before God, before themselves, before the actual particularity of their hours. By the crowd, he does not mean the mass of strangers in a public square. He means a state of soul. The state of soul in which you allow your judgments, your beliefs, your tastes, your reactions, even your prayers, to be silently outsourced to the chorus around you. Where you do not, strictly speaking, think anything, but instead absorb, like a sponge, the moods and assumptions of the people you happen to live among. Where you do not believe, but rather agree. Where you do not love, but rather belong. Where the question, "What do I make of all this?" has been gently replaced by the question, "What does one say at a moment like this?" You can be in the crowd, Kierkegaard says, while sitting completely alone. You can be a single individual in the middle of a crowded square. The difference is not geography. It is inwardness. He is hard on the crowd, much harder than we sometimes are today. He calls it untruth. He says the crowd is, in its essence, a kind of irresponsibility, because the crowd never actually exists. Only persons exist. The crowd is what you call a gathering of persons, each of whom has temporarily set down their personhood at the door, like an umbrella, in order to merge into a comfortable, faceless atmosphere. In the crowd, no one decides, no one commits, no one carries the weight. Whatever happens, the crowd did it. The crowd believed it. The crowd approved. And so each individual in the crowd is freed, for a while, from the terrible ache of being themselves. This, Kierkegaard says, is precisely why people are so drawn to it. Not because the crowd is wise. The crowd is rarely wise. But because the crowd is light. To be in the crowd is to set down, for a while, the burden of being a self. and the burden of being a self is, as he repeatedly insists, the heaviest weight a human being is ever asked to carry. But this lightness is a counterfeit. The weight does not actually go away, it only gets postponed. And one of the strangest, gentlest, most disturbing observations in all of his work is that the people who hide most thoroughly in the crowd are often the people who feel most empty when they are finally alone, because the self they have not become is still waiting for them, somewhere underneath the noise. Imagine, perhaps, an evening you have lived through. An evening of small talk and easy laughter, of nodding along, of saying the things one says, of agreeing with opinions you do not really hold. The evening goes well, by all outward measures. Everyone is pleased. Everyone is comfortable. And then, late, you find yourself alone, perhaps in the quiet of your room, perhaps in the kitchen with a glass of water in your hand, and a strange, small dread visits you. A dread that has no obvious cause. A sense that something has been missed. A sense that for hours, you have not really been there. That you have been, in some way, absent from your own evening. Kierkegaard would say that this small dread is the voice of the single individual whispering, very quietly, that it has not yet been allowed to live. He insists, again and again, that the single individual is the highest religious category, not the people, not the church as a crowd, not the nation, not even the friends of God as a faceless multitude, but each particular soul, alone before God, answerable, irreplaceable, undelegated. He says that on the day of judgment, you will not be permitted to answer in the plural. You will not be permitted to say, "We believed," or "we did," or "we voted." You will be required to answer in the first person singular. One. And the entire question of your life, he says, is whether, by then, there is anyone there who can speak that I. This is a heavy thought, so let us not let it press down too hard tonight. Let us hold it lightly, the way a candle is held by a hand that is not afraid of it. Let us simply notice that there is, somewhere underneath all our crowd-shaped lives, a small, clear voice that speaks in the first person singular. And let us notice, gently, that Kierkegaard's whole project is, in the end, an effort to give that voice room to speak. Chapter 6. Indirect Communication and the Art of the Pseudonym. If Kierkegaard had simply wanted to tell people, become a single individual, he could have written a short pamphlet. He did not. He wrote thousands and thousands of pages, in a strange and beautiful tangle of voices, under names that were not his own. Either/or was published under the name Victor Eremita. Fear and Trembling under Johannes de Silentio. The Concept of Anxiety under Vigilius Hofniensis. Stages on Life's Way under Hilarious Bookbinder. Philosophical Fragments and the concluding unscientific postscript under Johannes Climacus. The Sickness unto Death under Anti-Climacus. The names go on, almost playfully, and the books they wrote did not always agree with one another. They argued, they contradicted, they circled the same questions from different angles, in different moods, with different temperaments. Some of these pseudonymous authors were, you could say, more religious than Kierkegaard himself. Some were more aesthetic, some were more ironic, some were more despairing. For a long time, readers found this confusing, almost annoying. Why would a serious thinker hide behind so many masks? Why not just speak in his own voice and tell us what he meant? Was he being cowardly? Was he being clever? Was he simply showing off? He was, in fact, doing something very deliberate. And to understand it, we have to understand what he calls indirect communication. Direct communication, Kierkegaard says, is fine for objective truths. If you want to teach someone the multiplication table, you simply tell them. If you want to tell them that water boils at 100 degrees, you say so. There is no problem here. The teacher knows. The student does not. The teacher transmits. The student receives. The truth passes from one head to another, like a coin from one hand to another. But the deeper truths, the truths that depend on inwardness, the truths whose entire meaning is in how you relate to them, these truths cannot be transmitted in this way. If I simply say to you, you must become a single individual before God, you must take up the burden of your own existence, you must risk yourself in faith, what have I done? I have given you a slogan. You have received words. You can now repeat them, perhaps approve of them, perhaps even feel uplifted by them, but you have not necessarily moved a single step closer to the actual condition I was pointing at. In fact, you may now be further away, because you may now feel, comfortably, that you understand what is required, when in fact you have only learned a phrase. So Kierkegaard, like a good teacher of an art rather than a fact, decided to communicate indirectly. He would not lecture. He would not preach. He would write books that did things to you. Books that drew you in, made you laugh, made you uneasy, made you take up positions in your own mind, and then quietly turned those positions against you. Books that led you, very gradually, into your own inwardness, where the real work could begin, without anyone, including the author, getting in the way. The pseudonyms were part of this. Each of them is a kind of carefully constructed soul, living a particular form of existence, speaking from inside it. The aesthete in either/or is not simply describing the aesthetic life from outside. He is being it, on the page, in your hands, with such charm and intelligence that you almost want to follow him. And then, slowly, you notice the cracks. You notice the loneliness. You notice the way every passion he pursues curdles into boredom. You notice the small, hollow horror at the center of his beautiful life. And the noticing is yours. He has not told you. You have seen. This is the deepest reason for all the masks. Kierkegaard does not want you to receive his ideas. He wants you to make them yours. He does not want you to nod and agree. He wants you to wrestle, in your own inwardness, with possibilities that have been so vividly drawn, that they are, for a while, almost living inside you. He wants to be, as he put it, like Socrates, not a teacher who hands over knowledge, but a midwife who helps you give birth to the truth that was already, somehow, growing inside you, waiting. It is a slow, patient, gentle method. It does not produce quick converts. It produces, when it works, real awakenings. The kind of awakenings that come without any obvious cause, in a quiet evening, after long reading, when something inside you has finally, almost imperceptibly, shifted. And tonight, in this quiet hour, perhaps something is already beginning to shift inside you, simply by being patient enough with these old, slow, hand-stitched ideas to let them in. Tonight we have walked through the cold, lamplit streets of Copenhagen and met a thin, slightly stooped man, with a quick eye and a quiet, persistent sorrow. We have felt, just a little, the weight of the inheritance he carried, the great earthquake in the family, the melancholy that became for him a strange dowry. We have stood with him against the towering systems of his age, against the temptation to use grand ideas as a hiding place, against the seductive lightness of the crowd. We have heard him whisper that some truths can only be inhabited, not observed. And we have followed him, quietly, into the strange, patient method of his work, the masks, the voices, the slow art of helping a reader find what was already growing inside them. There is more to come. In our next quiet evening together, we will go deeper still, into the three great stages on life's way: the aesthetic life of the seducer, the ethical life of the judge, and the religious life of the one who, like Abraham on the mountain, is asked to do something no system can explain. There is no rush. The journey is yours, and it will keep. For now, let your shoulders soften once more. Let your jaw release. Let your breath become almost ordinary, almost unnoticed. Whatever has been said tonight will continue to settle inside you long after the words have passed. Some of it you will remember. Some of it you will forget. Some of it, perhaps the most important of it, will not seem like ideas at all by morning, only a small change in the weather inside you. Sleep gently, if sleep is what you are moving toward. Or simply rest. Or simply sit, for a few minutes longer, in the hush of this quiet hour, and breathe. We will continue, when you are ready, in part 2.